Okay, this is the last video for the linear functions packet, the second one, on absolute value. So just to refresh our minds a little bit, absolute value of a number is the distance that number is from zero. Okay, so you can think about it like a number line, for example. If I had a number line, and we'll do -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, and it keeps going on, right? Because there's a lot of numbers, an infinite number of numbers. Okay, so if I wanted to know the absolute value of, let's say, -2, I'm trying to see how far it is until I get to 0. So it's 1, 2. Okay? Or if I wanted to find the absolute value of, let's say, 3, +3, the same process. How far is it from 0? 1, 2, 3. Okay? So when you're taking absolute value of a number, it will always be positive, because the distance from 0 is always going to be a positive thing. So let's look here. We have a graph of the absolute value of x. Okay? You can think of this as a function. If it helps you to make a chart, an xy chart, that's okay. So this one says when x is 0, y is 0. Okay, when they plug in 1, for example, well, how far is 1 from 0? It's 1. Okay, but if you plugged in -1, like we talked about on our number line over here, its distance is also 1. That's why you see the point -1, 1 over here. Or if you plugged in -4, what's its distance from 0? It would be 4, which we see in this point over here. Okay, so this is your basic graph of the absolute value of x. Now, in this part of the book, we're looking at ways that we can manipulate this graph or change it. Okay, so one thing we can do is a vertical translation. Okay, when you do a vertical translation, if you look up here, we have one of y equals the absolute value of x plus 2, or we have one of y equals the absolute value of x minus 2. Okay? On these, you have that same graph that we just looked at, the y equals the absolute value of x. The only thing that changed is it either slid up or down on your y-axis, okay? So if you look at it, which one do you think, if you could write a formula, would be a formula for translating a line up, okay? Translating an absolute value up. We have it right down here. It's y equals the absolute value of x plus k, and k would be any number, okay? And it's a number on, well, here it would be on your y-axis, okay? If you wanted to translate one down, what do you think your formula would be looking up at this graph here? It would be y equals the absolute value of x minus k. Okay, and that would translate your graph down. Okay, so sometimes they will give you a description of a graph and ask you to write an equation, okay, for an absolute value graph. So this one, first example that we have is writing an equation for the absolute value that's translated 5 units up. So if we look up here, we have an example of what our formula should look like when it's translated up, okay? So you would just plug in, you could say y equals the absolute value of x, and since it's going up 5, it's going to be plus 5, okay? Or the second example asks for an equation when it's translated 7 units down. Well, we also have an equation for when it's going down that we can plug into, okay? So in this one, it would just be y equals the absolute value of x minus 7 because it's going down. All right, another way that we can manipulate our graph of the absolute value is by translating it horizontally, so moving it along the x-axis. So there's two different graphs that we have here to look at. We have y equals the absolute value of x plus 1. And you notice here that whole thing is in the absolute value. So prior we saw just the absolute value of x plus a number, okay, plus our k. This time everything would be written in the absolute value. So we have x plus 1 in the absolute value, and we also have y equals the absolute value of x minus 3. Okay, and this is a little counterintuitive if you look at this. When you are moving to the right or in the positive direction, you subtract the number. And when you're moving to the left or in the negative direction, it's being added. Okay, so that's going to be a little tricky to remember. So again, we said down here, the formula for translating it to the left is y equals the absolute value of x plus h, x plus a number, okay? And this goes to the left. And we have the formula to go to the right, which you can see up here, is y equals the absolute value of x minus h. Okay, so we can do the same thing we did before, and we can plug these into an equation. So if it wants one for an absolute value graph that's translated 2 units to the right, well, we have a formula for when it goes to the right. Remember, it's the opposite, so we subtract it. So we can say y equals, and the whole thing is in our absolute value here, x minus 2. Okay? Or, if it wants to know one when it's translated 10 units to the left, it would be y equals the absolute value of x plus 10. And the whole thing's in your absolute value. All right, we'll just take a look at one more complicated one. Okay, when you're graphing absolute value, always start with a regular absolute value graph, okay? So I have provided one here for us based on what we talked about before. And we're just going to manipulate what we have, okay? So when you have it, the first thing you can do is translate to the left or the right. And then you can translate up or down. And it really doesn't matter which of those you do first. That's just the way that I prefer to think about it. So it says, to practice graphing, y equals the absolute value of x plus 2 minus 3. Okay, so if we look here, this part in the absolute value is going to tell us our horizontal translation. And part being added or subtracted to it tells us our vertical translation. Okay? So if we are going to do our horizontal one, do we remember if we're adding the number in the absolute value, does it go to the left or to the right? It's a little counterintuitive. Remember, it's going to the left. So we need to move our graph over to the left. Okay? Then we've got this part of the equation done. Now it needs to go -3 or down 3. So we could just move our graph down 1, 2, 3 on our axis. Okay, and we would have a graph for the absolute value of x plus 2 minus 3.